Number 2 is on public security and police cooperation. My name is Todd Hatley. I'll be the chair of this panel. Our first participant, our first speaker is Hugues Rousseau. Hugues has served with the Canadian Foreign Service Officer for the past 33 years. He's currently the Minister Consul for Political Affairs at the Canadian Embassy in Washington. He was appointed there in 2009. And prior to that, he was served as Senior Advisor for the 5th Summit of the Americas to the governments of Trinidad and Tobago. There's a more detailed CV on Mr. Rousseau, but I'm just going to skip through it in the effort of saving some time. So, Hugues, please.
Merci beaucoup, Todd. The first panel is a pretty tough act to follow, but I'm sure we have very distinguished guests here. Me gustaría agradecer el Center Woodrow Wilson y el Virginia Military Institute de darme la oportunidad de estar con ustedes este día y compartir con mis amigos mexicanos sobre este tema. I know my colleague Tina Namiowski, Assistant Deputy Minister of Strategic Policy for Public Safety, was looking forward to participating. Unfortunately, she is unable to join us as she is at an international meeting on aviation security in Japan, one of the many organized in response to the failed terrorist attack on a plane headed to Detroit on Christmas Day. In speaking about the security environment, which is always changing as we saw on Christmas Day, the challenge often lies in enhancing our mutual security without compromising our privacy laws, our freedoms, and our cross-border trade. So how do we increase our mutual security without impeding trade, travel, and the freedoms that underpin North America? This is a task faced by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Canada Border Service Agency, and the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. Cross-border smuggling activities orchestrated by organized criminal groups and the predominant criminal threat encountered by law enforcement officers and at our ports of entry, this fact has consistently been identified in joint Canada-US border threat and risk assessments. Transnational criminals are not restricted by jurisdictional boundaries and are innovative and act quickly on perceived weaknesses at international borders. These groups are aware of law enforcement efforts, will displace activities to other regions as necessary, and will use counter-surveillance and diversion tactics. So how do we adapt to these realities to ensure that our jurisdictional differences are not being exploited by crime? Canada and the US have enjoyed a long and successful history of cooperation and collaboration in combating cross-border security and criminal threats. That said, since 9/11, we have entered into a new era of security partnership, which is underpinned by the implementation of innovative policing models that enhance our ability to identify, interdict, and prosecute criminal activity and across our shared border. Let me begin by highlighting two recent examples of enhanced law enforcement cooperation between our two countries. I would like to mention the agreement on integrated cross-border maritime law enforcement operations, better known as ShipRider. ShipRider is a good example of how we are enhancing border integrity through integrated cross-border policing. Through this innovative policing model, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or RCMP as it's better known, and the U.S. Coast Guard can now cross designated specially trained Canadian and U.S. law enforcement officers and better leverage existing resources. In simple terms, it permits the RCMP and U.S. Coast Guard officials to jointly crew marine vessels and work together to enforce the law on both sides of the international boundary, thereby denying terrorists, smugglers, and other criminals the illicit exploitation of our shared border. Unlike the traditional approach to border law enforcement models, this initiative enables the pursuit of criminals across jurisdictional boundaries and addresses a historic obstacle to effective law enforcement on both sides of the border. Recently, a shipwrighter pilot project was deployed during the 2010 Olympics in Vancouver. The pilot project permitted specially trained U.S. and Canadian law enforcement officers to enforce the law in shared waters between Vancouver and Washington to augment Olympic security operations. When I'm talking Washington, it's Washington State, of course. The project was a success and proved to be a good opportunity to showcase an effective and integrated law enforcement model. Although the shipwrighter agreement has not yet been formally ratified by Canada, we intend to introduce implementing legislation to regularize integrated operations during the current parliamentary session. The shipwrighter model builds on the 15 integrated border enforcement teams, also known as IBETs, already in place in 24 strategic locations along the Canada-US border. The IBET is a cooperative, intelligence-led, binational program that is designed to bolster the integrity and security of the border by bringing partner agencies together from both countries on a daily basis to share and consolidate criminal intelligence. This enables binational partners to collectively plan and deploy enforcement investigations aimed at dismantling organized crime groups that exploit the border for profit. The 5 core organizations are the RCMP, the Canada Border Services Agency, U.S. Customs and Border Protection Border Patrol, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and the U.S. Coast Guard. In addition, the federal partners, IBETs, also bring together law enforcement agencies at the provincial, state, and local levels. Integrated border enforcement teams have made tremendous progress since their inception in advancing cross-border law enforcement cooperation between local and international partner agencies. The coordination of information and intelligence by core partners has resulted in ongoing and increasing success for IBETs and more effective targeting of criminal activity at the border. The success of the IBET concept is due in part to the attention given to it at the annual Canada-US Cross-Border Crime Forum, or CBCF. The forum is a key Canada-US bilateral consultative mechanism developed in 1997 to encourage effective coordination between law enforcement and justice communities across the border and facilitates the resolution of impediments to effective law enforcement and prosecution of cross-border crimes. The Minister of Public Safety Canada co-chairs the CBCF with the Canadian Minister of Justice and the U.S. Attorney General and the Secretary of Homeland Security. Currently, working groups drive the agenda of the forum with the view to developing joint strategies and initiatives, best practices, and concrete tools to resolve operational, policy, and legal challenges. To give just a few examples of this work in action, the Border Enforcement Group has developed joint threat assessments which inform the activities of IBITs and seek to reduce the number of cross-border policing impediments. The Counterterrorism Group is engaged in efforts to facilitate joint terrorist financing investigations, and the Economic Crime Group is using intelligence to identify emerging trends in both mass marketing fraud and identify thefts and fraud activities to produce joint advisories for the public. Other groups are pursuing priorities related to drug and organized crime, firearms, trafficking, and prosecutions. To sum up the approach to police cooperation that has been taken at the Canada-US border, we work to build trust and develop a shared understanding of the risks and the necessary cooperation to address shared risks through intelligence-led and integrated policing. I would like now to address Canada's bilateral security cooperation with Mexico. Many of the challenges I mentioned earlier related to cross-border crime extend beyond Canada and the U.S. to include the entire continent. In light of this, Canada strongly supports Mexico's efforts to combat organized crime and is committed to increasing cooperation with Mexico. There are a number of existing mechanisms for security dialogue and cooperation, including the annual security consultations created in 2007 and led by the Department of Foreign Affairs Canada and Mexico's Secretary of Foreign Relations. These consultations provide a forum for officials to highlight past and ongoing activities and identify new opportunities for cooperation. Public Safety Canada's primary mechanism is the Security Working Group led by the Department and Mexico's Center for Investigation and National Security. The working group was created to promote strategic cooperation. Its work plan includes initiatives related to emergency management, marine security, and law enforcement. The group has delivered on many initiatives, including joint threat assessment, training sessions on combating organized crime, through the seizing of profits derived from criminal activity, and reciprocal visits to port facilities to exchange best practices on port and marine security measures. Officials are now working to formalize the working group and update the work plan to enhance existing cooperation in policing, corrections, and crime prevention in support of Mexico's ongoing security sector reform efforts. Public Safety Canada has expanded its work with Mexican counterparts in its fights against drug trafficking and transnational organized crime. To effectively combat transactional organized crime, Canada is contributing to the development of a well-trained and professional police force in Mexico. For example, as announced during the 2009 North American Leaders Summit, a group of Canadian police officers, along with trainers from the U.S., participated in basic training for 1,500 police officers in Mexico last summer. This fall, the RCMP also provided training to 300 middle managers as well as 42 police executives through the Canadian Police College as part of Mexico's international training program. The RCMP is now working on the development of a mentorship program for graduates of this program and the provision of further specialized training in policing with funding from Canada's Anti-Crime Capacity Building Fund. These types of training initiatives can be effective because they give new recruits the tools they need to do their work, but also because they help to develop relationships and trust amongst our police forces. We've also had a recent number of high-level visits to Mexico to highlight our commitment to the bilateral relationships. I think this was mentioned before. Transnational organized crime and terrorism, in all its various forms, cuts across domestic and foreign policy agendas and demands law enforcement cooperation. Officials continue to explore ways to work trilaterally to strengthen the hemisphere's response to transnational crime and other security issues. As my colleague Guy Saint-Jacques mentioned in his remarks this morning, we each have our own experiences we can pull from. Further cooperation between nations and all security actors is a key to secure North America and protecting the cross-border trade flows that economies of all our countries rely so heavily on. This is my last page. Areas that would benefit from further trilateral cooperation include security sectors, capacity building activities in Mexico and the Americas. This would contribute to the safety and security of the entire region. Now, more than ever, strengthened cooperation and coordination on aviation security and efforts to build sustainable solutions to the current threat is vital. The attempted terrorist attack that occurred in the U.S. on December 2009 has reminded us that the international community must work together to raise international aviation security standards. Therefore, I will now cede my place to my American colleague. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
All right, our next presenter is Alex Lee. Alex runs the Bureau for Western Hemisphere Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. He's the Director of the Office of Mexican Affairs at the Department of State. Previously, he was the Director of Canadian Affairs. Mr. Lee?
Thank you. Thank you very much to the Woodrow Wilson Center and the Virginia Military Institute for giving us this opportunity to discuss this issue in public security and police cooperation in a kind of a trilateral dimension. From the U.S. perspective, as we enter the challenge of strengthening our trilateral cooperation against transnational crime networks, we try to be cognizant of the different bilateral enforcement and security relations we enjoy bilaterally, because basically I think we tend to work bilaterally, and then from that we figure out how we can tease out trilateral opportunities for working together. During the 20th century, law enforcement cooperation between the U.S. and Canada has evolved to the point that it is now extremely well established. This cooperation is so deeply rooted that it is almost invisible to our respective citizens. Indeed, this bilateral law enforcement relationship has functioned very effectively regardless of whether the personal relationship between our respective national leaders has been good, bad, or indifferent. It just works on automatic pilot almost, which is a kind of what our goal is when we talk about institutionalization. It's really a remarkable achievement. In contrast, the United States and Mexico, for a variety of historical reasons, did not forge a similarly robust law enforcement institutional relationship during the 20th century. Our bilateral cooperation in these areas was fundamentally ad hoc, often based at the working level, and often based on personal relationships rather than on institutional linkages. Indeed, it was not until the conceptualization of the Merit Initiative in 2007, with its recognition of our shared responsibility to combat organized crime and drug trafficking, that both countries began to develop a systematic effort to institutionalize our bilateral law enforcement cooperation. I was going to talk and sketch a little bit about how the various mechanisms that over the years have evolved in our bilateral law enforcement relationship with Canada, but my Canadian colleague has essentially covered that ground for me. I do want to flag that the IBETS program, the Cross-Border Crime Forum, the Shipwriter, all of these mechanisms really are very at the federal level, and their connections with state and local actors and provincial provide a rich network of cooperative operational synchronization, of sharing information, both intelligence and law enforcement, that really has made a major difference in enhancing the law enforcement capabilities of our respective law enforcement organizations. And I think the Shipwriter one really deserves some close attention, because it demonstrates a commitment by both countries to overcome those thorny jurisdictional issues that are at our borders as we try to figure out how we deal with transnational criminal organizations and not let them take advantage of the crevices between our respective national sovereignties. So we're particularly proud that the Shipwriter agreement was negotiated and put in effect, and I think it offers a very interesting model for future possibilities. Turning to Mexico, without question, the Merit Initiative has really accelerated a process of institutional cooperation in both countries. I mean, one way of looking at it is that we're in the process of building kind of institutional linkages or neurons that didn't exist before. And it's a process that has gotten started and has continued and continues to evolve, and I'll talk about that in a minute. From 2008 to the present, the U.S. Congress has appropriated about $1.3 billion to support the Merida Initiative's engagement with Mexico. That assistance was we initially focused kind of an equipment-heavy based package of law enforcement cooperation and envisaged providing helicopters for rapid mobility, non-intrusive inspection equipment to help interdict contraband, training for federal police, prosecutorial, and other judicial system personnel, capacity building for NGOs and civil society organizations to support the law enforcement strengthening process, just to name a few types of assistance. Under the Obama administration, we have worked not just to maintain our support to Mexico to combat organized crime and drug trafficking, but to broaden our law enforcement cooperation. In recent months, the U.S. and Mexico have been engaged in planning process for expanding and deepening our cooperation under the Merida Initiative. We have agreed to focus our efforts in 4 areas. One of them is disrupting organized criminal groups. Another is institutionalizing reforms to sustain rule of law and respect for human rights. A third is creating a 21st border to facilitate trade while enhancing our respective security. And finally, building strong and resilient communities. The first 3 objectives will be joint endeavors, while the latter, the building of strong and resilient communities, our role will be relatively modest, supporting Mexican government initiatives. Our intention behind this evolution of our assistance and our cooperative relationship with Mexico is to transition away from large equipment items to more institution building activities. In the new area of building resilient communities, we intend to help Mexico implement its community and economic development plans, but basically offering lessons learned in our experience and maybe helping in catalytic role, but very much of a secondary role. The Mexican government's efforts against the cartel since the beginning of the Merida, and indeed before, because the Mexican government launched its effort against the cartels long before we reached the Merida Agreement, has been really impressive. And you can cite a variety of statistics, whether it's illegal arms seized or persons raised, or the noteworthy successes late last year and early this year against high-value targets, which I think suggests increased capabilities in a very significant manner. Again, I think the most important thing to emphasize is this cooperative, increasing sharing of information. And this information has been very helpful in our own law enforcement activities, because one of the things that makes the Merida Initiative unusual is that we took upon ourselves the responsibility to do certain things on our side of the border. Initially, our commitment was that we would try to figure out how we could better control the smuggling of weapons and bulk cash going from the U.S. down to Mexico through our borders. And the various announcements that you've heard from DHS And if you look at the statistics, that effort is paying off because we have reallocated resources and personnel to that effort. In addition, another kind of reflection of this cooperative relationship has been the success of two major U.S. law enforcement, actually international law enforcement exercises, one known as Project Coronado, another known as Operation Accelerator, which arrested, in one case, 303 alleged members of a drug trafficking organization, in another, over 700, millions of dollars, lots of weapons, lots of drugs. But this kind of exercise, this kind of law enforcement cooperation, really benefited from information exchanges that we've had with Mexico. And this is a virtuous cycle. As we obtain information on how the cartels operate in the U.S., we can help share information that will make Mexican law enforcement efforts in Mexico even more successful. So what we have is a very mature, established, cooperative law enforcement relationship with our northern neighbors, and a very dynamic, evolving, promising law enforcement relationship with our southern continental neighbor. I think there is no, to be honest, the best way to think about any trilateral cooperation is trying to build on what each side, what we're doing, I'm speaking from a U.S. perspective, what we're doing already with our continental partners, and then trying to figure out whether there are areas that we can work collaboratively in a trilateral process. As my Canadian colleague has already indicated, we have both identified areas in which we can be supportive of Mexican efforts. Police training is one very good example. We're both working separately, but perhaps in the future we could work more collaboratively on judicial reform, which is, as Mexico is transitioning from its old inquisitorial written-based system to an oral-based accusatorial system, we see Mexican judicial leaders very interested in learning, okay, how do you in the United States and how do you, Canada, work the prosecution of evidence-based cases? How do you do plea bargainings? How does that change our ability to process and prosecute cases? So that's another area worth looking. And I think a third area that's very promising is for the three governments to see how we can work collaboratively in supporting judicial and law enforcement assistance programs in Central America and in the Caribbean. The U.S. has launched a process of law enforcement cooperation and programs to support it in Central America, which are getting underway. We're just beginning to launch a process of law enforcement cooperation in the Caribbean nations. So I think there are also possibilities, and I know our Mexican and Canadian colleagues at a conceptual level welcome the idea of looking and identifying maybe possibilities to work collaboratively in this region. So I think that's an area to look at. Thank you very much.
All right, our next presenter is Jose Luis Calderon. Mr. Calderon is the academic coordinator of the Program on Intelligence for National Security at the National Institute of Public Administration in Mexico City. His research interests include human resource development within security agencies, intelligence and national security, and information and intelligence systems. Mr. Calderon? Oh, and I believe your presentation is in Spanish?
Yes.
Yeah, it's in Spanish. Español.
Muchas gracias. Es deber inicial agradecer a los organizadores que me hayan distinguido con la invitación para participar en esta conferencia. Yo me voy a permitir hacer algunas reflexiones basadas en mi experiencia profesional sobre profesionalización, particularmente de personal al servicio de órganos de seguridad del Estado. Como ustedes ven, el título de la exposición se refiere a viejas soluciones a nuevos problemas de seguridad en México y la cooperación con Norteamérica. Voy a hacer un primer acercamiento a cómo veo yo el problema de seguridad en mi país, para después hacer un planteamiento respecto a algunas propuestas. Me parece que la inseguridad en México ha tomado un nuevo escenario. Antes estábamos acostumbrados a que pasaban los grupos de narcotraficantes por los estados, por los municipios, y a cambio de dinero o a cambio de mantener la tranquilidad en el municipio o en el estado, no pasaba nada. De repente empiezan a surgir grupos como los Zetas, como la familia, y que surgen para trabajar con estos grandes carteles. Yo creo que aquí sí hay una revolución, o va a haber una revolución. Estos Zetas, este grupo de la familia, grupos criminales, van a un estado y el ejército, la Marina, la Policía Federal, las policías estatales y municipales, pues están enfocados a su combate. Esto desde luego no le conviene a los carteles, porque como nosotros decimos, les revuelve el avispero y no les permite trabajar con la fluidez que lo hacían antes. ¿Por qué es un nuevo paradigma de inseguridad en México? Bueno, porque antes, por un lado, estaba el tema de los narcotraficantes y por otro lado estaba el tema del delincuente común, y lo que sucede ahora es que estos grupos de los Zetas, de la familia, empiezan a actuar de manera independiente. Es decir, empiezan a llegar a los pueblos, luego a ciudades más grandes, y empiezan a extorsionar. Ya no es la extorsión telefónica la que había hace 3, 4 años, ahora son extorsiones por el derecho de piso, ¿no? Y ya no es el secuestro a la gente más señalada por sus ingresos económicos, sino todos son sujetos de la extorsión, y los medianos empresarios pequeños, el carnicero, el del negocio pequeño, es sujeto a la extorsión y sujeto al secuestro. En ese sentido, pues, ha crecido geográficamente, territorialmente, el problema de la delincuencia, y no solo en términos territoriales, sino esta extorsión que antes no existía en nuestro país. Había secuestros, pero no eran, eran muy señalados, y era también sobre un grupo poblacional muy específico, y ahora, lamentablemente, esto se ha expandido. El incremento de la penetración del crimen organizado en los cuerpos policíacos no es nuevo tampoco, pero lamentablemente se ha generalizado. ¿no? Las cifras que se muestran ahora que se está haciendo el famoso control de confianza es verdaderamente dramático. Jorge Tello, en el Atlas de la Seguridad y Defensa de México, del cual es coautor Abelardo Rodríguez, señala con mucha claridad el problema de la inseguridad, este nuevo problema de inseguridad en nuestro país. Es un artículo corto, pero yo me he permitido extraer tres afirmaciones. La primera, que dice que el monopolio de la violencia y la recaudación de impuestos corresponde al gobierno. Lo que está sucediendo en Michoacán, Chihuahua, Tamaulipas, Sinaloa y muchos otros estados de la República es motivo de alarma nacional. Este artículo se escribió a fines del 2007, principios del 2008 y se publicó en diciembre del 2009. Continúo con la cita de Tello, y que dice que hoy queda claro que se teme al delincuente, lo que está en duda es si existe alguna autoridad a la que la delincuencia le teme. Y después dice que los procesos delictivos son siempre graduales, progresivos, es decir, de una infracción menor, desde luego exitosa, y vamos a ver por qué, nace el atrevimiento de escalar a toma de riesgos mayores, en busca de mejores beneficios, y es la progresión geométrica del crimen producto de la impunidad. No hay delito pequeño, esa es la razón de ser de los modelos policíacos de cero tolerancia. El secretario García Luna presenta este triángulo de la evolución del delito en nuestro país, cómo evoluciona el delincuente, y empieza robando a transeúntes, después en robo a casa habitación, robo de carga de vehículos, robo de valores y asaltos bancarios, secuestro, etc. Pero alrededor hay los levantones, ¿no?, que se dan entre los propios narcotraficantes o los grupos criminales, y estos a su vez se dedican al incremento, a la extorsión, insisto, no la extorsión telefónica, sino otro tipo de extorsión mucho más lacerante, y surgen imitadores, es decir, llegan y yo soy de los Zetas y ahora me vas a pagar tanto por proteger tu negocio, ¿no?, o de la familia. La inseguridad en México está representada por delitos del fuero común, el 90%, delitos federales, el 10%. Y queda claro que el problema es un problema no es un problema policíaco, es un problema de gobernabilidad. Los delitos se están dando en las ciudades, en los pueblos, en las poblaciones, de pueblos muy pequeños hasta muy grandes. Y los delitos federales son del 10%. Y es aquí donde está, en este 90%, es donde los Zetas, la familia, ¿no?, que además cooperan con el 10%, con su cuota del 10%, están lacerando la convivencia pacífica de la sociedad mexicana. Más grave aún es que la inseguridad en México, ¿no?, se mide por indicadores de impunidad, que, citando a un investigador a Jorge Espina, que es presidente de la Coparmex, dice que la impunidad se incrementó a 91,45%. Guillermo Cepeda, del CIDAC, del Centro de Investigación para el Desarrollo, dice que la probabilidad de que sea puesto a disposición de un juez el probable responsable es de 1%, es decir, hay una impunidad de 98,3%. Y en la mayoría de las estadísticas, dice Cecilia Sayek, del Instituto Ciudadano de Estudios de Seguridad, que la mayoría de los países las estadísticas muestran los casos resueltos, es decir, por la identificación y la condena del delincuente en México. Estas estadísticas no existen en nuestro país. Esto último quisiera yo resaltarlo porque si no tenemos información, ¿cómo podemos hacer inteligencia? Y no me refiero a la inteligencia táctica, no me refiero a la inteligencia operativa, me refiero a la inteligencia estratégica. Si no conocemos cómo nació la familia, La familia es peligrosa porque no es un grupo criminal común y corriente, es un grupo criminal que actúa con base a una doctrina, que además son fundamentalistas, es decir, invocan a altos, ¿no? a Dios, en fin, para hacer sus fechorías. Hay que estudiarlos bien para poder atacarlos. ¿Y cómo nacieron? Ese es el tema, y cómo han seguido creciendo y cómo han ido expandiendo esta doctrina para hacerse de una organización criminal muy poderosa. Desde luego que hay un círculo vicioso que habría que romper, ¿no? Porque por un lado la impunidad provoca este éxito al que se refiere Jorge Tello, ¿no? Pero por otro lado no hay instituciones que combatan, ¿no? Entonces hay que romper ese círculo vicioso. Un círculo vicioso que, para empezar, está expresado por la improvisación de los mandos policíacos, ¿no? Y cuando digo improvisación, me refiero a que de los últimos años a la fecha se están nombrando generales, ¿no? Antes en los municipios se nombraban a mayores, a capitanes, ¿no? Ahora se nombran generales a los municipios y a los estados. Y qué bueno que lo están haciendo. Cuando yo escucho manifestaciones respecto a que el ejército se salga de las calles, me parece, uno, que están mal informados, que no conocen la realidad de la inseguridad pública en nuestro país. Dos, que fueron mal informados por quienes les pasaron la información. Y tres, lo hacen de mala fe. El problema de la participación del ejército, y me refiero concretamente a esto de la titularidad de la Secretaría de Seguridad Pública estatales y municipales, me parece muy grave. Y me parece muy grave porque estamos deteriorando una institución que desde siempre, cuando ustedes leen las encuestas de simpatía ciudadana, están en el segundo o en el tercer lugar. Porque primero es la familia, después es la iglesia y después el ejército. O la familia, el ejército y la iglesia. Y después, por mucho, vienen las demás instituciones. Por otro lado, estamos poniendo en riesgo a los militares que designan, o que se están designando en los estados. En Cancún falleció un distinguido general, en Nuevo León falleció otro distinguido general, en Tabasco hirieron de gravedad a otro general. Esto pues me parece que tiene que tener una solución. Hay un abandono del servicio profesional de carrera policial, si es que alguna vez lo hubo. Hay una experiencia, la Policía Federal de Caminos tenía una carrera policial muy exitosa, con la fusión esta que se hizo para crear la Policía Federal Preventiva, se fue perdiendo lamentablemente esta tradición. Pero en general hay un abandono de la carrera profesional. Y cuando yo digo profesional, quisiera referirme a Huntington. Él dice que hay tres elementos que integran la profesionalización. El primero tiene que ver con el conocimiento de la experticia de la profesión. El segundo tiene que ver con una convicción del compromiso social que la profesión tiene. Y el tercero, de esta necesidad de sentido de pertenencia a una comunidad profesional. En México no tenemos una comunidad profesional de seguridad pública, porque el general que lo nombran, pues él sigue perteneciendo al ejército. Y abajo no tiene ningún apoyo, ¿sí? Un comandante de una zona militar que lo cambian a otra zona militar no tiene ningún problema. Él se sienta y hay manuales para todo. Y el que lo sigue sabe perfectamente cómo funciona la comandancia. ¿Por qué? Porque hay manuales, hay los famosos libritos, ¿no? que más se lo saben porque cuando entraron a la escuela naval, cuando entraron a la academia militar, al colegio militar, ellos sabían que entraban de cadetes, pero que en algún momento serían generales. Y hasta llegar a coroneles es el puro mérito. Y este mérito tiene que ver precisamente con el conocimiento de esta doctrina. La profesionalización se amalgama con doctrina, con códigos de ética. De ahí pues que es necesario incorporar a militares, pero incorporarlos con una previa inducción al puesto, es decir, vamos a sacarlos de la calle y vamos a regresarlos a los cuarteles. Sí, pero hay que regresarlos otra vez, pero como especialistas en seguridad pública, con un conocimiento claro del marco constitucional, del marco jurídico administrativo, del marco administrativo, del conocimiento de la política de seguridad pública del país, con un conocimiento claro de qué tiene de los derechos humanos y la vinculación con la sociedad. Para concluir, les diría que es importante este tipo de reuniones porque entre mejor comprensión haya entre los países respecto a nuestras culturas que son distintas, podemos entender mejor cómo colaborar entre nosotros. Y en ese sentido, por ejemplo, la colaboración hasta hace unos días era solamente a nivel federal, es decir, PGR, CISEN, la Policía Federal, etcétera, pero no con estados y municipios. Empieza la colaboración con estados y municipios. La capacitación en términos generales, por ejemplo, en inteligencia es operativa, es táctica, pero no hemos trabajado el tema de la inteligencia estratégica. En México no hay una cultura de inteligencia estratégica. Habrá que promoverla, porque es fundamental para entender el problema que estamos viviendo. Y la selección de los participantes en los cursos no existe. Hay quienes han tomado 3, 4 cursos que ofrece el Departamento de Estado, en fin, ¿no? Con esto yo terminaría solamente para decirle que la colaboración necesita de un diagnóstico integral con una visión estratégica, que hay que construir conocimiento sobre la seguridad pública de nuestro país o de México para atacarla de una manera integral. El tema de la inseguridad no es solo policial, me parece. En este sentido quisiera ser muy preciso. Si estamos de acuerdo que el problema de inseguridad en mi país es de seguridad nacional, pues vamos a aplicar el poder nacional. Tuvieron que morir 16 chicos para que se volcara, ¿no? No solo Defensa Nacional, no solo Marina, no solo Policía, sino Educación, ¿no? Lo que yo lamento es que a la cabeza esté el secretario de Reforma Agraria, pero bueno, pero cuando menos ya hay una primera reacción. Enfatizar el programa de formación de mandos. No hay mandos en seguridad pública. ¿Cómo podemos atacar el problema de inseguridad? Y desde luego yo soy de la opinión que deben ser los militares. ¿Por qué? Porque tienen doctrina, principios, valores, saben lo que es una carrera profesional, porque además tienen prestigio, pero no hay que dejarlos solos. Y hay que darles instrumentos, ¿no? Que regresen como especialistas, ¿no? Que no va el general, no. Porque miren ustedes, y con esto termino, el problema es que el político administra sus riesgos. ¿Y qué hace? Pues antes nombraba a su jefe de ayudantes, al jefe de campaña, a su amigo que era bueno para los golpes en la preparatoria y lo defendía. Ahora no, ahora dicen, piden acuerdo con el general secretario y dicen, general, mándeme ¿no? Y el general les manda un general. ¿Qué pasa? Si hay problemas, dicen, mire, ni lo conocía. A mí me lo mandó el general secretario, yo ni lo conocía. Y ya se les administran sus riesgos, ¿no? En caso de que no sea la gravedad tan extrema, lo que hacen es decir, oiga, hay problemas, ya saben que el general va a hablar a la defensa y les van a mandar 3,000 efectivos para que lo apoyen. Tenemos que ser más serios en el combate a la inseguridad. Y en ese sentido me parece que es muy importante hacer inteligencia estratégica. Es más importante conocer bien el problema de la inseguridad que es tan importante como los otros apoyos. Les agradezco mucho su atención.
All right, I'm I'm going to ask Geraldo Rodriguez Sanchez to step forward to give his summary of the panel. Mr. Sanchez is a member of the CACIDA, Network of National Security Specialists in Mexico, as well as a professor on terrorism at the Mexican Army Studies Center. You want to speak
Yep.
from there? Okay.
I would like to thank the Virginia Military Institute and both Mexico and Canada Institutes of the Woodrow Wilson Centers. Aussi mes remerciements à l'ambassade du Canada. And I will use a phrase of Celia Cruz. My English is not very good looking, so, and I'm seeing that most of the people in this fora is well Spanish speakers and listening. So, es un honor para el CACEDE, una red de especialistas en seguridad nacional que lleva apenas 3 años de haberse fundado por Raúl Benítez y en el que tengo el honor de participar junto con José Luis, con Abelardo Rodríguez, y decirles que el CACEDE cree que esta es una reunión histórica porque se encuentran sentados con nosotros oficiales, civiles y militares, y también estamos sentados aquí con compañeros de universidades y think tanks de Estados Unidos y Canadá. A manera de resumen, y creo que esa debe ser la labor de un discussant más que ser una cuarta conferencia aquí, quisiera un poco cuáles son los puntos más importantes que encontré en las ponencias de los dos oficiales de gobierno de Estados Unidos y de Canadá y de nuestro compañero José Luis Calderón Arrosqueta. En primer lugar, creo que queda claro y yo creo que es algo que queda evidente tanto de este panel como del anterior, que la agenda de cooperación en materia de seguridad pública en la región de América del Norte está dominada en un 90-95% por las relaciones bilaterales entre México y Estados Unidos, entre Estados Unidos y de Canadá, y yo creo que un muy inicial 5% estamos viendo inicio de cooperación bilateral en materia de seguridad pública y policial entre México y Canadá. No digo por esto que la cooperación sea nueva, sin embargo, están dominadas por los primeros 2 clusters, los primeros 2 cajones dominan el 90%. También yo quisiera destacar de la ponencia de Hughes Rousseau el tema de la cooperación invisible entre Estados Unidos y Canadá en materia de seguridad pública y que fue reforzada por el comentario de Alex Lee, que Alex Lee dice que ya están en un piloto automático. Ese piloto automático no se conoce y no se aprecia cómo funciona en México. Y son muy pocos los especialistas en materia de seguridad nacional, seguridad pública en México, que conocen esta experiencia histórica en materia de seguridad fronteriza entre Estados Unidos y Canadá. Entonces, cuando los mexicanos en foros internacionales en México escuchan o los periodistas, las ONGs y los propios funcionarios del gobierno escuchan de esta gran cooperación que existe histórica en materia fronteriza México, Estados Unidos, Canadá, que se vio reforzada con el acuerdo de Smart Borders después de los ataques del 11 de septiembre de 2001, hay sospecha, hay también interés de cómo funciona, ¿no? Y creo que en la relación México-Estados Unidos ha habido grandes avances en la cooperación en materia de seguridad pública de los dos lados de la frontera, entre los gobiernos locales del lado de la frontera mexicana y del lado de la frontera estadounidense. Obviamente sorprende todavía más en México cuando se escucha y se escucha hablar del NORAD, del Acuerdo de Cooperación entre Estados Unidos y Canadá. Y creo que algo que es realmente inédito para muchos mexicanos sería cómo está cooperando con este programa, que realmente es para México es algo nuevo que no se conoce, obviamente la Armada de México, la Marina sí lo debe conocer, el Shipwright Program. Creo que esto es algo innovador que México debe estudiar para ver cómo se pueden cooperar también las armadas entre México y Canadá y México y Estados Unidos. Destaco de la conferencia de Alex Lim el reconocimiento a la labor de México y en especial de la administración del presidente Calderón, el combate frontal al crimen organizado. Pero sobre todo destaco una fórmula que él claramente puso como el pivote, la piedra ancla a donde podría aumentar la cooperación vía la iniciativa Mérida, que es el aumento de la cooperación de información entre México y Estados Unidos en materia de seguridad pública, para lo que para México creo que sería lo más importante, que Estados Unidos siga haciendo su labor en territorio de los Estados Unidos para contrarrestar dos fenómenos que le afectan a los mexicanos y a las fuerzas de seguridad de México, que es el tráfico ilícito de armas y el tráfico de precursores químicos, ¿no? Y en segundo lugar, que es un viejo debate entre los mexicanólogos y los expertos en Estados Unidos en México, que es la reducción del consumo de la droga. Ese creo que es un debate que se está viendo superado, o para México causa gran expectativa el trabajo que está haciendo ya Estados Unidos basado en la iniciativa Mérida, del trabajo que ellos están haciendo aquí en territorio nacional para apoyar los esfuerzos que hacen las fuerzas del orden en el país. Y de José Luis Calderón, creo que hay también una humildad intelectual por parte de la academia en México de reconocer que este es un nuevo fenómeno de violencia el que vive en México. No se habían visto los vínculos perversos que puede haber entre un uso indiscriminado de armas de alto poder, atemorizar a funcionarios locales y estatales, y en donde estamos entrando en un círculo vicioso en donde los líderes del crimen organizado atentan directamente contra la gobernabilidad a nivel local. Y ese creo que es el principal reto que tienen los tres poderes de la Unión en México, las 32 entidades federativas y los 2.400 municipios que tiene el país. Y regresando al tema de la responsabilidad que tiene Estados Unidos en esta lucha frontal que está llevando a cabo el gobierno del presidente Calderón, quisiera destacar también, como lo hicieron en la anterior reunión, en el anterior panel, que la iniciativa Mérida sí está generando un nuevo paradigma en materia de cooperación, en materia de seguridad y de defensa entre los dos países. Es un salto cuántico de lo que Abelardo también comentaba, del SPP, de la Alianza para la Seguridad y la Prosperidad de América del Norte. Y como bien reconoce también Alex Lee, es la manera en que los dos países están institucionalizando una relación que hoy por hoy ya trascendió un gobierno en los Estados Unidos, porque fue arrancado con el gobierno del presidente Bush y continuado por el gobierno del presidente Obama. Esperemos que la cooperación se siga institucionalizando por el bien de los dos países y que trascienda también gobiernos sexenales en México. Yo aquí dejaría mis comentarios al respecto de las tres intervenciones y me permitiría, si Todd me lo permite, lanzar la primera pregunta de discusión al panel antes de darles la oportunidad de que el público también cuestione y pregunte a nuestros amigos y funcionarios de esta mesa. Y es lo siguiente. Esta pregunta sería sobre todo para Alex y para Hughes. Como funcionarios encargados de una relación bilateral, al lado de Hughes, por el lado de la relación entre Estados Unidos y Canadá, aquí en la Embajada de Canadá en Washington, y Alex Leak por su doble experiencia como miembro de la Oficina para Asuntos de México y Asuntos de Canadá. ¿Cuáles son los ejes estratégicos de futuro? ¿Cuáles son los temas que ustedes ven en que se puede avanzar la cooperación trilateral más allá del tiempo que a ustedes les consume trabajar los temas bilaterales? ¿Cuáles son esos temas trilaterales que sí nos podrán unir a los tres países en materia de seguridad pública y no en materia de defensa, ¿no? Muchas gracias, Todd.
Esa es una pregunta bastante interesante y muy difícil, Gerardo. Te lo agradezco mucho. No sé si el micrófono funciona así. No hay duda. There is no doubt that Canada and the United States have had an extraordinary relationship for many years, and I guess it's pretty much recent that we've integrated the concept of North America with Mexico. And I think probably our second or third largest embassy is now becoming our Canadian embassy in Mexico, because we understand the importance of a trilateral consultation and cooperation that has really started to progress quite a bit. There isn't, I think for Canada, the whole question of security is something that is quite recent and came probably around the famous 9/11 catastrophe. We always believe that cooperation is mostly based on, I would say, prosperity. And if people are happy in their countries, they will stay in their countries. And if we can ensure the type of cooperation that makes it normal to have prosperity for everybody that deals with us, that will make it a much even better collaboration and neighborly, how could I call, existence. What is the future? Well, like I guess the first panel said, and we are trying to say, is that we do have to speak more often. We do have to dialogue, make more dialogue. We do have to try to, because there are so many aspects to a collaboration. We can not only talk about security, we also have to talk about prosperity and the fact that and we have maybe also to give away a little bit of our own sovereignty. If you saw this shipwriter question, you can see that Canada and the United States collaborated together to be able to have our partners come into our waters or us come into their waters to eradicate some of the problems we have together. This is also something that Mexico may have to talk about. The general mentioned something about respect, and that is very true. You have to respect the sovereignty, you have to respect the culture, you have to respect the people. At the same time, there is a mutual, how could I say, regard for trying to help each other. So maybe a little bit of that sovereignty has to be shared so that everybody can prosper. It's such a complex question, Gerardo, that I think we could use a panel just to talk about it. I mean, just a full day. But maybe I'll leave a little space to Alex here.
Te pasaron la bola,
See,
Alex.
I'm just passing.
Okay. I think it's going to be a challenge for us to think in a trilateral fashion to establish pragmatic, viable, sustainable mechanism that address real need on a trilateral basis in public security. I think we've seen some possibilities. I think one of the first ones is training. We've already seen where Mexican Federal Police graduates of their academy down in San Luis Potosí, which we're supporting and Canada's supporting. One of the training modules included the folks to go to the FBI training school and then the Canadian Royal Mountie Royal Canadian Mounted Police training module. But I think that's something different from trying to fashion mechanisms that work. There are actually a couple of mechanisms in existence that could be useful and are in the process of being expanded. On the, you have these two bilateral mechanisms along the border, the IBETs in the north for the most part, and the BESTs in the south, which incorporate bilateral law enforcement personnel. Perhaps for certain kinds of crimes, you could create a trilateral mechanism. We haven't really grappled with that particular issue, but maybe there's something there. I think there's a very area for fruitful thought is, and again, it's fundamentally bilateral, but it has three-way implications, and that is how we structure our law enforcement cooperation along the borders, and how that, in a way that facilitates trade. Again, fundamentally, two bilateral exercises, but there may be best practices that can be incorporated to the mutual advantage of the three countries. And then I think another possibility is there is an interesting mechanism that we have negotiated. We have, each of us have emergency management agreements. U.S.-Canada, U.S.-Mexico. And these mechanisms help us deal with emergency management, natural disasters, in which, you know, our respective agencies can only have authorities to work on one side of the border and the other side of the border. There also may be lessons learned and possibilities of teasing out ways that in a trilateral fashion we could support these mechanisms when we start thinking rather ambitiously in a continental fashion. And then finally, and here's probably the big prize, and it's probably the hardest, is how do you think about and move forward towards lessening a focus along the border. And if you do that, then you have to focus on kind of the wider perimeter. And that represents huge sovereignty challenges that will be very, very thorny to work out, that we haven't really grappled with.
Okay.
Okay, we got 5 minutes, so we got time for a couple of questions. We'll start over here. The mic's going to come to you if you wouldn't mind stating who you are and your question, please.
I'm Margaret Daly Hayes, and my question goes to the comment from Jose Luis Calderon's presentation on the challenge of forming a leadership cadre in the police institutions in Mexico. I think I heard a slight criticism of the effort to train large numbers of policemen without addressing the building of an institution and of this leadership cadre. And I'd like the trainers perhaps to comment on what efforts are being made to fill in, and perhaps Jose Luis to expand a bit on this challenge. Thank you.
Sí, particularmente en estados y municipios estamos seguros de que policías se forman, ¿eh? El problema está en lo que tú dices con toda precisión: no hay liderazgos, no hay mandos, y eso implica un programa distinto. Por ejemplo, en Ciudad Juárez, el año pasado egresaron 800 policías de la academia, con programas muy bien diseñados, pero si tú les preguntas si en paralelo formaron mandos, la Policía Federal reclutó y formó, como ya lo decía mi compañero, mi colega Alex, a 3.500 policías investigadores. pero solo cuando hasta ahora el informe por la mañana es que han formado 42 mandos, que no creo que sean suficientes. O sea, ¿quién va a dirigir a estos 3.500 policías investigadores que acaban de formar? Con doctrina, sin duda. Pero eso implica una correspondencia, ¿no? Esa es mi tesis. O sea, hay que formar instituciones, exactamente. Y esas no se forman solo con formar. Es como si el ejército solo formara soldados. Bueno, pues no. Hay una estructura institucional que hay que fortalecer.
I guess that's exactly the type of comment we like to hear in a way, because I guess the whole question of training is kind of new and it's nascent, and in that way we know it's not perfect. So it has to start somewhere, and after that, when we start getting to see what results come out of it, then we can readjust the type of training. And if we are told that it's more important to form cadres than the basic police officer, well, then something that will be readjusted. I guess there is also a question of education and having some kind of a tradition of police. In Canada, we have one. Everybody recognizes our police because they wear red serge, but they're much more than just a uniform. They're a way of policing, and maybe that is also something that we can try to help is on the question of education. But there is no doubt that your question is absolutely excellent, and the type of response is we are not Mexican, we are Canadian, and sometimes we have to understand the culture a little better to be able to help a little bit more. So all of that is, thank you very much for that, because it's certainly something that I will be reporting back to Ottawa.
I'll take two. There's two questions against the wall there right behind you. Can I have both the questions first before we get a response from anybody?
Sure. My name is Claire Silke. I'm from Congressional Research Service, and I just wanted to ask, what is the role of the defenses in each of the countries in planning for the public security cooperation? Because Meritus mostly public security focus, and what is the role of the defense departments of each country in that? And also, is there sharing going on, showing examples of interagency cooperation that maybe you've had successes in Canada or the United States? And is there an interagency? I just see a disjunct, like a breach between what the Mexican military may be doing and what the Mexican police and the federal police, and there may not be as long a tradition of the interagency, or maybe there is, and I just don't know. But I was wondering about that.
Thank you very much for that question.
Next question.
Sorry.
And then
Yes, Tony Quainton from American University. I'm struck by the one area we haven't talked about, and perhaps even won't talk about in the third panel, that the topic is bedeviled by the addition of the words "in North America." That it does seem to me that trilateral security cooperation can be thought of outside of North America, to the degree that our three countries share concerns about narcotics trafficking, transnational crime, health, and so forth, that a way to build trilateral security cooperation is to look for ways in which our three countries might diplomatically work together to promote security issues in a larger world, and not just to amplify the bilateral relationships which have been so eloquently described today. And I wonder whether our panel thinks that there is possibility for trilateral security cooperation outside of North America as well as inside.
whoever wants.
Oui, merci beaucoup. Donc, oh yeah, of course. I don't know if you were there for the first panel, ma'am, but Admiral Donaldson talked about the success of the 2010 Olympics in Canada, and I can tell you that if it came out without a hitch, it is because of an extraordinary interagency cooperation, not only between the different factions that provide security in Canada, but also the ones that provide security in the United States. And we're talking about intelligence gathering, intelligence sharing, and all sorts of other types of cooperation between not only our military but our police. And I don't know if the Admiral is still here or if Captain de Vaisseau Richard Bergeron est ici, but all I know is that they could probably answer that question very well. I think there's been an extraordinary amount of cooperation between our two countries on that side due to the fact that it's necessary now simply because of what's happening in the world. And I don't know how we could transmit that to our Mexican colleagues, but it is certainly something that goes into the second question, where should we start having more cooperation than just trilaterally in North America? And I would say yes, of course, and I think we are doing it quite a bit with our European friends and also with many of the Latin American countries. So it's a growing industry, there's no doubt about it. Maybe Alec has something to say, but...
Let me try part of Claire's question. I mean, Merida, from the conception, was fundamentally a law enforcement building bridges and relationships. And the focus was on the civilian side. There is a defense component to it. Some of the most expensive elements in the procurement of the U.S. assistance goes to the Mexican military in the form of either transport helicopters to the military as kind of backup transportation or maritime surveillance planes for the Mexican military or helicopters for the civilian federal police. But again, I think you need to see Merida as that it's fundamentally designed to help strengthen the lead of and build the capacity of the federal Mexican law enforcement agencies, in which our respective militaries have an important but supporting role. Now that role may evolve, and they're very promising areas of cooperation on a bilateral that I suggest might possibly hold a trilateral opportunity would be the maritime surveillance aspect. The Mexican Navy and the U.S. Coast Guard and the U.S. Navy are in the process of forging a very productive maritime surveillance relationship that has led to some significant law enforcement successes. Whether we look at a trilateral approach in the hemisphere, parts of the hemisphere, I think that's still a work in progress.
Jose Luis? No? Okay. We're going to call it there because we're late for lunch. I'd like to thank everybody on the panel. Thank you for your comments.